So welcome everyone. Welcome to our 52nd web debate. This is the last web debate this year, and we could not have picked a more important topic to kind of round up this year. Because today we're going to talk about the climate change negotiations, and in particular, the recent climate change negotiations, COP26 in Glasgow, which ended less than a year ago. And our focus is going to be the perspective from the global south. So welcome everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to see you. Let me introduce our speaker for today, because we have a very eminent speaker with us, and I'm very happy that he could join us. I'm going to be very brief, which means I won't do it justice, but let me give you an impression of the very rich diplomatic as well as scholarly activities and career of Ambassador Kishan Rana. So Ambassador Kishan Rana is Professor Emeritus and Senior Fellow at Diplo. And we are lucky that he is teaching on a number of courses with us. This includes 21st century diplomacy, bilateral diplomacy, and economic diplomacy. His career in the Indian diplomatic service spans more than 35 years. Just a few examples: he was ambassador and high commissioner for Algeria, Czechoslovakia, Kenya, Mauritius, and Germany. He was also Consul General in San Francisco, and he served on the staff of Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi in 1981 and 1982. He's also a prolific scholar and writer when it comes to diplomacy. Let me give you a few examples of his books. There's Inside Diplomacy, Bilateral Diplomacy, The 21st Century Ambassador, Asian Diplomacy, Diplomacy of the 21st Century, The Contemporary Embassy, and Diplomacy at the Cutting Edge from 2015. We're also lucky that he has published with us a number of blogs and policy papers. And one of his recent blogs was actually on COP26, so the recent climate change negotiations. And he wrote that blog before COP26, kind of giving an impression of his expectations and kind of an overview of what to expect. And now we kind of take this opportunity after COP26 to kind of look back, assess, and kind of look at a couple of lessons learned. Before I give the floor to him, let me also remind you, our audience, that we want to make this debate as interactive as possible, which means we are looking for your comments and your questions, which you can put here in the chat, and I will bring them later into the discussion with Ambassador Rana. But for now, without further ado, Kishan, would you like to lead us into the topic and share a couple of reflections about the recent COP and the climate change negotiations?
Thank you very much, Katharina. My thanks to you and to Diplo as ever for providing a platform for discussing topical issues. You know, way back, I think it was in 1979 perhaps, but I could get the date wrong, when Indira Gandhi said at Stockholm, at the first major global gathering on environment issues, she said, poverty is the biggest pollutant. And in a sense, that forward phrase sums up the dilemma of environment management, climate change, and everything else. We have a situation where a country like India is a huge contributor to carbon emissions, but it's also a country with a per capita income still in the range of maybe $2,500 per person. So we simply cannot condemn 1.3 billion people to perpetual poverty in the name of stopping emissions. But of course, we are all global citizens and we have our obligations. So our dilemma is how to manage this balance. We have to have development, but we also must manage development well. And I hope to give you a few examples during our conversation to illustrate the way in which we approach this. But Katharina, I don't want to load too much onto a first set of remarks because I know you have some specific questions, and maybe that is the better way for us to converse, if you agree.
Absolutely. Excellent. I do have a number of questions. These are some of the things that are kind of on my mind. They're kind of three broad areas that I'm really interested in, which is questions of global solidarity, because we're talking about the climate change negotiations from the perspective of the global south. Then there are questions around the role of science, and what really interests me is basically the science is clear, the solutions are clear, yet it seems to be so difficult to actually act on it. And then lastly, some questions around something very interesting, which is the question, is diplomacy failing us in kind of addressing these global dilemmas? But let me get to this first point on global solidarity. And this brings me also back to your blog post that you published before COP26, because in the blog post, you refer to a very important principle that you kind of also hinted at right now, which is common but differentiated responsibility. To my knowledge, this was introduced in 1992 at the Rio Summit. And as you describe in your blog, it was supported in particular by countries from the global south to different degrees, but there was generally this kind of support for this principle, common but differentiated responsibilities. So if we now look at the climate change negotiations that just happened in Glasgow, my question is there a sense of global solidarity? Do we see this principle of common but differentiated responsibility in action? And also, what about the solidarity of countries among countries from the global south? For example, in your blog post, you hint that there might be a danger of, for example, the group of the G77 splintering, kind of this lack of solidarity possibly. So how do you look at this? And what is your sense of where we are right now?
Let me, instead of giving you a lot of blah, blah, let me get to specifics. As we know, coal is at the heart of much of the current debate. So let's come to coal. Let's talk about coal. India and China is also in the same boat. India cannot abandon the use of coal because it remains the most effective means available to us for generating energy. But at the same time, we have to begin the shift away from coal, and we are doing that. And I'll give you specifics. Currently, the non-fossil installed energy capacity in India is 156 gigawatts out of a total energy capability of 390 gigawatts. That is 40% is renewable energy. Now, we had promised to achieve this number at COP21 by 1931, but we've done it in 1921. Now our commitment is to take this to 500 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030, which will then represent 50% of our total energy usage. But there are things we can't do, and one of them is abandon coal. Now, you may say, isn't this absurd? Coal is known to be a great carbon emitter. But let's be honest. At COP26, we didn't see too much conversation about controls on hydrocarbons, which are also emitters of carbon, but to a lesser degree. Can it be that a number of countries that have strong interests in hydrocarbons and gas, including gas, did not particularly want to talk about it? So again, we come back to this notion of common but differentiated responsibility. India is not a major user, comparatively speaking, of hydrocarbons because we still use coal. But we are shifting away from coal, and we are shifting away from coal not to hydrocarbons, rather much more towards solar energy and other renewables, which don't generate carbon at all. And that is the shift. Now, what is the problem? Why can't we shift faster? It's a question of money. It's a question of the resources that were promised that would be delivered, made available to developing countries, to the global south, which have not appeared. And we don't talk very much about it. So there is a great deal of conversation on the fact that India talked of phasing down of coal and not phasing out of coal. Because we can't be dishonest. We can't promise something which we know we cannot deliver on. I'll give you another example. Now, it is said that there should be no subsidies for non-renewable energy. But how do we manage? I mean, look at the dilemma in India. For the poorest of the poor of India, who live in the villages, who live also in towns, who live in the countryside, live in forests, they either use coal or wood, which are both extremely unfavorable to the environment. So we help them to shift from those heavily polluting substances to the somewhat less polluting substances like gas, like gas that's supplied in cylinders at subsidized prices. It is part of our gradual shift because they cannot shift to renewable energy. Solar energy, for example, for cooking is a wonderful dream, but very, very difficult to actually implement in real life. So, you know, how does the global south, and India is a typical example, maybe a huge example, how do we shift to new patterns of energy usage, renewable energy usage, less polluting, non-polluting usage at a pace that we can afford, for which we have money. If we don't have the resources, who do we go to? There is no rich uncle who's going to give us a handout. So these are the real dilemmas of managing energy policy in a poor country like India. Now, was there a breakdown among the global south? There wasn't, because I think we managed our narrative reasonably well. Yes, the small islands, developing countries, SIDS, are very, very concerned with rising sea levels. But so are we, because we are also going to be devastated. We have a coastline of 4,500 kilometers. We have towns, cities right on the coast, and there is going to be massive disaster as sea levels rise. So we also have a stake in it as much as anyone else. But we have to find a solution. And I think rich countries need to do more than they have actually done so far. They have made promises. Now it's time to deliver on those promises. And we are now going to go into COP27 next year at Cairo. Fine location, because it's a developing country, a country of the global south, a major country of the Arab world that faces all the typical problems of a large developing country. So these are our dilemmas.
Yeah, thank you so much for this outline. Really insightful. I have, where is that? What was really interesting was this question that you already hinted at, that coal appears in the final text of COP26, which in itself is a great achievement, because so far even the word fossil fuels, to my knowledge, has not appeared in an outcome document of a COP. So a great achievement here. But at the same time, some activists would say there has been some watering down. So, for example, as you also mentioned, from phasing out coal, you moved to phasing down coal, and you gave some reasons for that from your perspective. What I also find interesting, there was an intervention from India just a few days before the closing plenary, which talks about the fact that we need to look at all fossil fuels, and also in particular by the developed countries, which really chimes well with what you just said. But back to this question of solidarity. So you mentioned there was not a breakdown of solidarity among the global south. From my perspective, when I also look at other topics such as COVID-19, there is a sense that we do see signs of solidarity, but largely as a global community, if you want to use that phrase, we are failing on that front, at least in my assessment. Do you share that assessment? And what are the reasons? Why do you think we are not able to kind of create that solidarity, even if you would say not solidarity for as a value, but just for your own self-interest as a country, because as other countries are suffering economically, this will always come back to have an impact on all countries. So why is it we're struggling as a global community so much with these kind of questions?
Katharina, that's again a very pertinent issue. And I'm glad you brought in COVID-19, because COVID-19 is part of the story. We have to live with it. We initially offered large quantities of vaccines to a number of developing countries, and we delivered them. But then we ran into our own major second wave, which was in the middle of this year, towards the early part, maybe around April, May, and it continued for about 3-4 months, when we had to really hold back on those vaccines for national use. Every country has to prioritize its own population, while at the same time having a sense of global commitment. Now we've gone back to offering vaccines to other countries. And what have we done in the meantime? We have now, for a poor country, this is a pretty remarkable achievement. We have 80% of the adults who have received 1 dose of the vaccine, and over 40% who have received double doses. And what we are now working on is we are delivering double doses literally at the household of the poorest people. It's now a campaign that has shifted not to camps where vaccines were offered, but now mobile teams go and offer vaccines literally in the homes of people across the country. Our daily delivery of vaccines, it may astonish you, for a poor country, limitations of transport, communications, resources, we are delivering between 10 and 20 million vaccines per day. That's not a small achievement for a poor country. And it may also interest you that in India, we don't see vaccine hesitancy. I think that is a privilege only of the rich. Only the rich can say, oh, the vaccine is available, but I will not use it because I have XYZ apprehensions, etc. I think our feet are much closer to the earth. Poor people don't live in great big palaces. So we understand that this vaccine is a lifesaver and we need it. So we're doing it, and we are now beginning to deliver vaccines to other countries. But Katharina, there is also a problem with delivering vaccines. Around the world, you will find stories of vaccines that have expired, the validity date has expired, or countries for one reason or another have decided to destroy the vaccine stocks because they don't like that country, or they don't like, there is an impression that those vaccines are not so reliable. And this has happened with American vaccines and all kinds of vaccines, not just our vaccines. So we have to find a balance. I mean, this pandemic is a game changer in so many ways. It has forced us to confront some of the basic issues of human existence, where in the face of disease, we are all equal. There are no rich and poor when disease strikes. And maybe this will bring a deeper sense of humanity. But Catherine, I have to bring in two related issues which are not often talked about. Number one is our failure to treat development and the upliftment of people in poor countries as a universal human right. Why? I ask this often to my friends who have vast multilateral experience. I said, how could human development not be included in basic human rights? Nobody has given me an answer to that. The second related question is that the great migration crisis that we witness in Western countries in particular is also a product of poverty, and it is also a product of lack of development. So, all these things kind of fit back into the same old problem. Is there a common human condition that we need to address? Because when you have a per capita income of $70,000 or more, you maybe see the world differently than if you are a country with $2,000, $2,500. And that's true not just of India, all across Africa and Asia, that situation is replicated. So are we going to learn anything out of this, either the pandemic or the climate crisis?
Exactly, that is the key question. I'd like to, if I may, I'd like to move slightly to a very related topic, which is around the question of science, and in particular,
Yes.
Science plays a huge role when we talk about COVID-19, identifying the virus, finding a solution to that, but obviously also for climate change. Science is really at the core of explaining climate change, analyzing it, projecting global warming temperatures into the future, and really highlighting that if we stay on the course that we've been on for the last couple of decades, we face massive global warming and tremendous amount of consequences to our planet, but also to ourselves. So in a sense, the science is very clear, and the science not just points to the problem, kind of makes those projections in terms of relating carbon emissions in the atmosphere to global warming, and then explaining what are the consequences of this tremendous amount of global warming that we might be facing over the next couple of decades. But science is also very clear on the potential solutions. So with all that in mind, it seems really almost mind-boggling that if you look at the diplomatic process, things are moving rather slow. I mean, as we just mentioned before, this is the first time that fossil fuels have been mentioned in an outcome document of a COP. So in your opinion, as a very experienced senior diplomat, what explains this, perhaps from my perspective and from the perspective of a lot of scientists, this mismatch between, on the one hand, we have clear evidence, we know what to do, but we don't quite manage to actually do it. So what explains that mismatch? And perhaps what can be done in the future? And let me just give you also a little bit of context. I'm asking this question also because at Diplo, we're at the moment running a course on science diplomacy. We also have 1 or 2 people from the course in the audience today, which is fantastic. And so that's a question that comes up in that course over and over again. We have quite a number of scientists there, and every time we talk about these issues, we talk about climate change, for example, in the course, it's really interesting to see the evidence is clear. There's a huge amount of academic literature. There is academic consensus. We know what to do, but basically we're not doing it. What explains this, in your opinion?
Carolina, I wish I had an answer that could, throw some brilliant light sunshine on a complex issue like that. But look, I go back to my point I made a moment ago, which is, why is vaccine hesitancy such a huge problem in Europe and North America also, and not such a big problem in much of the global South? Number one. Number two, does this signify a certain distrust of science? I think in the global South, we are still enchanted by science. We still believe that science is a savior, science is our friend, our ally, and we have to work with it. And you see this in the number of people from Asia in particular, not just India, but also China and Southeast Asia, and Japan, of course, who are scientists, who study science, who study the STEM subjects, and who kind of vote with their feet when it comes to science. The larger question, is diplomacy failing? Well, diplomacy is all about countries. Countries are still the sovereign actors. Yes, the non-state actors, the non-state constituencies, civil society have a louder voice, and rightly so. But negotiations are conducted between states, helped by the different non-governmental organizations, civil society, the media, scientists, and everybody else. So if there is failure, it is a failure of the international system itself. The system knows what should be done, but somehow doesn't manage to do it. I mean, we can go to the United Nations and say, why is the United Nations really so ineffective on the pandemic? I mean, honestly speaking, what has the United Nations done? WHO, yes, a fair bit in difficult circumstances of non-cooperation by a major country, China, to name a name. And China has a perspective. China doesn't want to be labeled as the originator of the pandemic. But I don't think that's more or less a non-issue today. There is a pandemic wherever it originated. So we have to deal with it. And that is where all countries can put their shoulders to the wheel and help in finding solutions. India is one of the relatively few global South countries that has an autonomous vaccine manufacturing capability of its own. We do the best we can. We work with others. We are completely open to collaboration, and we have no hesitation whatsoever in working with other countries, other companies, other entities. People don't remember very well, perhaps, but during the AIDS crisis, it was India that came out with a cocktail of medicines for AIDS, which was sold literally for pennies. And that played a major role in curbing the spread of AIDS. And that happened because under the copyright formula, there is a provision for use of copyrighted or patented materials for the public good. So we come back to the notion of the common good, or what are called the global commons. The global commons are global. The global commons belong to everybody. And that is where it goes back to the point you began with, which was common but differentiated responsibility. Nice words, lovely phrase, but it's not been acted upon. So if fingers are going to be pointed to say that why did India move from phasing out to phasing down of coal, why did we not talk in that document about the hydrocarbons? funds? Why did we not talk about a clear, net, transparent commitment to funding the global South countries for dealing with the climate crisis? So this is a bundle of issues. You tackle one, or you are interested in one, you find it connects with so many others, and we have to, of necessity, bring up all these issues because these are complex issues.
Yes,
Maybe we
very,
should
very.
shift to questions because I don't want to hold on forever. I think it's much rather that we listen to others.
Yes, exactly. This is a great reminder. We're looking for your questions and comments. You can put them in the chat. Since this is also a very familiar environment, you can also raise your hand here and ask a question in person if you want. But Kishan, before we go to the audience, which again is a reminder to put your questions in the chat if you have any, to bring your questions into this conversation. I have one last one actually, and as you see, I have a very familiar theme here, which is around the questions of what can diplomacy achieve and where is it, so to speak, failing. And this goes back to something you mentioned in your blog as well, because you mentioned the climate activist Greta Thunberg. And she made a very powerful statement before the COP. She was basically saying this is just blah, 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 all these terms, nothing is really happening, it's just blah, blah, blah. From that perspective, how do you react to this as a senior diplomat, as someone who lived and breathed this? And obviously, diplomacy is a language game, as we've just discussed. It is about negotiating terminology. It is about arguing the most minute details. So then we have this notion that all of this, because it seems so ineffective from the perspective of climate activists, is in the end blah, blah, blah. How do you respond to this?
It's a glib way of describing a set of problems. Yes, there is a lot of blah, blah, blah that takes place at multilateral gatherings of all kinds. But you know, Greta and her ilk, who live in the great comfort of rich Scandinavian societies, I wonder if they understand the dilemmas of the poor of the global South. I wonder to what extent they have actually felt the pain, the stark, brutal choices of poverty. So it's easy. I mean, I'm full of admiration for young people. They are the future. There's no nonsense about it. They are the people who will deal with the heritage of our foolish actions of the past. No question about it. So they have a right to be concerned. They have a right to be angry. I applaud them for that. But they should also perhaps see a little bit of what is the real situation in the poorest countries and how the poor, in spite of their poverty, retain their dignity, their self-respect, and their commitment to doing good things. You think it's easy for a poor family to switch from burning branches of wood and replace it with cooking gas? Okay, cooking gas is not the best alternative, but it's the only viable alternative. Burning branches for cooking, apart from everything else, it causes huge health damage to the people who do the cooking. And it shortens their lives by years and years because of those smoky fires over which they are crouched. These are real harsh choices. So for us in India, supplying coal-generated power is still a better option than burning half-dry branches of wood that generate huge quantities of smoke. Now, in your countries, you've never had a situation where anybody burnt wood for daily cooking. When did that happen? 200 years ago? It's a matter of daily life all across the global south. Go to Africa, go to much of Asia, the same dilemma. So, by all means, be impatient. You have a right to be impatient. I applaud that. But please also blend with it a little bit of compassion, understanding, and modesty, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. What you just said really chimes well with one of the questions we received. So first of all, there's this comment that young global climate activists not only come from the global north, so they don't all come from Norway or Sweden or Europe. There are actually, and this is great to see, from my perspective, this is great to see how that community is growing, and also the visibility of young activists that are not coming from the global north is much better than it used to be. So that's great. But the question basically then is, how do we bring these voices more directly into the negotiations? And from your perspective as a diplomat, do you think this would be welcomed by diplomats? This also reminds me of a blog post that Jovan wrote before COP26, which was on how to bring youth into this conversation. And he was kind of saying, talking through different options, and maybe even just doing it on a symbolic level by having a chair that represents young people in the negotiations, to remind people that this is about the future and that the people negotiating will actually not face the consequences of the outcomes and implementations of these negotiations, but it will be the younger generation.
I have no easy answer to that, but the fact is that more and more it is developing countries that take on their delegations representatives of civil society, and they are treated as full members of the delegation, as participants. I think that is one way out. But there is a comment from Mr. Atif Ahmed that many countries refuse to make climate change an integral part of their foreign policy ethics. But they do. More and more they do. They are forced to do that because their own circumstances, their own situation forces them to do that. It may be perhaps an underestimate to imagine that climate change is not a major goal for every country today. At least speaking for India, it certainly is a very major objective. And there's another comment from one of our Diplo colleagues about developing countries refusing to stop emissions in the name of development when they themselves will be more affected by climate change. Yes, you're right. And that is also part of the dilemma. But you can't also say that just because historically we were colonized and empires were built on our backs, empires which stole our wealth into Europe. I mean, let's be honest about it. Does that mean that we are condemned forever to be poor? Does it mean that we have forfeited our rights to a higher level of human development and dignity? So what do? We have to find a balanced way out. One of the ways out is, will rich countries put their money where their mouth is? That is to say, are they willing to finance the process of climate adaptation, of new measures, new actions that will bridge the gulf between what should be done and what is not possible to do in these countries? These are real dilemmas. It's not a question of finger pointing and say, oh, it's all your fault. I think we move beyond that. I think even common and differentiated responsibility is no longer used as a slogan. You will have noticed, Katharina, I think the phrase was hardly evoked. But the reality remains that the global commons have been spoiled, have been polluted massively by those who were the early developers. At that time, nobody cared. So does it mean that they are forever exempt from contributing to the devastation which they initiated?
Mm-hmm. A great comment, almost a great final word, but we're not quite there yet. There's another question and comment we received here on Zoom. If you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube, we're also monitoring those there. So last chance to put your questions there. But the comment is the following: more and more industries emitting poison to the environment are being built in sub-Saharan Africa. The majority of the owners of these industries come from rich developed countries, yet they argue for climate change. What are your thoughts on this?
I'm not sure if that is actually the case. I don't think there is massive investment taking place in Africa or Asia or any other country for that matter, any other part of the world, which exploits their environment simply to load it onto them. If somebody could give a concrete example of where this is happening, maybe we can talk about it a little with greater clarity. But I honestly don't know that this is happening.
Thank you for that comment as well. So we've just got a couple more minutes left. So what I would like to do, also in the absence of any additional question, is to give you the floor for perhaps a very brief final word, final reflection, perhaps anything we should take into this week as we keep thinking and discussing on this topic.
Katharina, I would rather if somebody else were to take the floor and give their comment, because I've spoken long enough. I think I've said all that I needed to say. Maybe Ginger, if I can put her on the spot, or anybody else. I see one George Thomas in the group. He looks like somebody who comes from my part of the world. Maybe George Thomas would like to step in and make a quick summing up comment or a final viewpoint. The floor is open.
Yeah,
Please.
Indeed. The floor is open. Let's wait for just a few seconds for anyone to take that great opportunity.
Anyone jumping in, please. No, I don't see anyone.
Okay, then still, any final words from you, Kishan?
Katrina, what more remains to be said? Let me end with a small piece of good news. I don't know if this story reached you. You know, every country undergoes what's called a demographic transition. And we've had a major survey whose results are just out 4 or 5 days ago, a week back. And what they've revealed is that the total fertility rate in India has finally gone down to 2%. That is to say, as against the replacement level of 2.1 children per woman, which would ensure a stable population, we are now on the downslope of demographic dynamics. And we make a difference between urban TFR rates, total fertility rate, and the rural TFR. Our urban TFR was always low. It had crossed several years ago. It was the rural TFR that was in the zone of 2.6 or so. Now, rural TFR has hit 2.1. That means the total TFR of India is below 2. This is good news in the sense fewer people will mean a smaller load on the Earth's resources. And still, this is something that was not expected to happen for another 7 or 8 years. And I don't know how or why. Comparable to this is that China's TFR has also come down much faster than anyone had expected. So here are two of the world's most populous countries that are now at the point of shrinking their populations. And that is for the globe, for Mother Gaia, good news.
Thank you so much. Excellent final words. Kishan, Ambassador Rana, it was an absolute pleasure to have this conversation with you and with all of you who joined us today. Thank you so much for taking the time for this last web debate in the year. With our web debates, we will be back next year in February. We take a little break for January, so we'll be back in 2 months' time. But there's another event I would like to bring to your attention in case you cannot wait 2 months. We have another event on the 21st of December, which focuses very much on the practice of diplomacy. So it's really of interest on so many cross-cutting issues. Throughout this year, we have been doing what we call a historical journey through diplomacy, so exploring different diplomatic styles over the centuries, the impact of information and communication technology, again, over the centuries, 19th century, 20th century. And now on the 21st of December, we're basically having the concluding event. The topic is learning from the past, looking to the future. It's on 21st December at 14 CET. I will put the description here in the chat so you can follow that up. You can also find it on our website under events. It would be great to see some of you there because that will also be a great opportunity to kind of round up the year and round up our discussions. But for now, let me thank again our speaker, Ambassador Kishan Rana, and all of you who took the time to join us today. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much. My thanks to Diplo and to all the audience. I greatly enjoyed this. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
I think that's how really consume.